Stanford University.
Well, it is great to see you on a milestone evening. It's amazing to think that we've come to the second quarter and we're about to end it tonight. I'm curious, how many of you have been here? How many of you are here during the first quarter? Wow, it's amazing. And how many will, so you've done two quarters. How many are coming back? Wow. Well, you know, my avocation when I'm not doing this sort of my personal pastime is running marathons, and you are on one. I would say you're not quite yet at mile 20. That'll come in a few weeks, but your endurance is very remarkable, and I really appreciate it. So tonight's topic is an interesting one, and many of you might have wondered why did we select mind-body interactions? And I have to tell you, just in passing, that my own interest in this topic began more than 4 decades ago. And Dr. Spiegel, our speaker, doesn't know this, but when I was a medical student, I began doing experiments on the impact of social dominance on the risk for infections. Now, this took place in mice, but it was in the field that emerged as psychoneuroimmunology, a field that has taken place over the last several decades that Dr. Spiegel is one of the world experts in. And it connects some of the things that you've learned about already in terms of how our mind works, and will serve as a prelude to actually the first topic in the third quarter, which is the sort of basic fundamentals of immunology, the system that protects us from infection. And you'll learn tonight more about how our mind influences the outcome of disease. And the area that Dr. Spiegel has been most noted is, of course, in the interactions of the mind in relationship to cancer, particularly breast cancer, and his seminal work in this area, as it has been in many of the other impacts of stress on outcome of health, has really been extraordinary. He began his journey, as others have on the East Coast, starting out in New Haven, migrating up to Massachusetts, so from Yale to Harvard to medical school, training in psychiatry, and then spending his important professional career here at Stanford, where he has been really one of the pioneer leaders. And one of the areas that he has spent a lot of time working on, and I suspect we'll speak about as well tonight, as part of mind-body interaction, is the field of hypnosis. And I've learned more, not only about his interest in this, but the legacy that began with his own father in hypnosis. And I'll tell one short story that may horrify Dr. Spiegel, and it's my own encounter with hypnosis. So here's the story. As a teenager, growing up in New York in an immigrant family, but being very curious about learning, I decided that I wanted to do away with sleep because it was a waste of time. And so I concluded, and I was about 16, that if I could just do REM sleep, I would be able to, do away with the wasted hours in bed. And I reasoned that the way to do that was to learn self-hypnosis so that I could quickly get to REM sleep. Probably an artificial way of thinking, but I found my way in New York City to a hypnotist, probably not a very high caliber one, certainly not your dad, who was quite prescient in one way. He tried to teach me, he took my money for it, the art of self-hypnosis, but concluded after the second time that I was too controlling as a personality, and therefore was not a good subject, which was probably one of his wiser moments, and that has turned out to be true in life. So tonight, we'll have a less controlling person who's actually been an expert in hypnosis and in this exciting area of mind-body interactions, Dr. David Spiegel.
So the absence of hypnotizability gives you a 100% prediction that you'll become a dean. I can see that. Actually, Phil told me that it was a room full of gluttons for punishment, and they needed a psychiatric consult. So here I am. In line with what Dean Pizzo said, I want to dedicate this lecture to the memory of my father, Herbert Spiegel, MD. He died last December 15th at the age of 95. 3 days before he died, he was at Lenox Hill Hospital, not as a patient, but treating a patient I had referred who had intractable vomiting of pregnancy, and she was actually ordering food and starting to eat. So he died in the saddle the way he would have wanted to go. And I visited him a few days before. He had a shelf full of books on the neurobiology of consciousness and was lecturing me on it, telling me what was right in them, what was wrong in them, telling me what to read. And I said, Dad, you know, you're 95, why don't you give yourself a break and read a novel or something? And he said, David, there's enough fiction in the nonfiction I read. So I also had the great privilege and pleasure of writing a textbook on hypnosis, trance, and treatment with Dad. The first edition was in 1978 when I was just starting my career, and we've just recently published another edition. And although he was faculty at Columbia, we had a memorial for him there. I want you to notice that I got him into a Stanford shirt. So, and much that's in this lecture are things that I have learned from him and want to pass on to you. So what I'd like to talk about is mind and body in medicine, and I'd like to set up a kind of a contrast between modern biomedicine and very long traditions of healing, because some of the techniques we use are actually very old techniques. And I'd like you to just think about the ways you have been learning about the development of medicine and some other traditions. So in modern biomedicine, one of our major interventions is pharmaceutical agents, drugs. In traditional healing, it's herbs. So they're less refined substances that have a long tradition. Many of them don't do anything. Some of them do interesting things, actually. And one of the problems is that when an herb becomes effective, we redefine it as a drug. So the treatment for dropsy, which was congestive heart failure in the 17th century, was an herb called foxglove. And the key element in foxglove is digitalis. And so we now use digoxin as a primary treatment for congestive heart failure. So there has been some back and forth between traditional and modern biomedical treatments. Surgery is another major part of biomedical intervention. Various kinds of manipulation, ranging from therapeutic massage to acupuncture to yoga, have been a component of traditional healing. Psychotherapy is a domain that is related to modern biomedicine, but the first use of psychotherapy in Western culture was hypnosis. It's the first time a talking interaction was thought to have therapeutic benefit. And hypnosis is as well a part of traditional healing, along with mindfulness, meditation, many other techniques of self-regulating, of helping people to manage their own mental and emotional state. In modern biomedicine, we study disease-related stress. In traditional healing, we study stress-related disease. And so what I hope to do with that context is give you some examples of what we've learned about mind-body interactions. Now, one reason there's a problem is our current health environment. I'm sorry, Mr. McConnell. Your insurance plan only provides for empathetic nodding and a saddened downward glance. There's a $200 copay for any additional words of compassion, not to exceed 40 words or 3 expressions of sympathy or condolence. And all I can tell you is I wish this were funny. Unfortunately, it's far too close to the truth. And I think one of the reasons that patients have sought mind-body treatments of various kinds is that we've forgotten the oldest adage of medicine, which is that our job is to cure rarely, relieve suffering often, and comfort always. And with the Flexner era at the beginning of the last century, when medicine went from being a trade that you learned by apprenticing yourself to another physician to a science, which was a wonderful advance. So medical schools started to become scientific institutions rather than simply following a doctor around and learning to do what he or she did. We redefined medicine in a way that had advantages but disadvantages. So the new job definition became that our job was to cure always, relieve suffering if you have the time, and let someone else do the comforting. And I think that's equally wrong, because no matter how good we get at medicine, the death rate will always be 1 per person. Sooner or later, we're all going to die of something, and we will need people to help us whether or not they can cure us. And I think that's been one of the indictments of modern insurance-driven healthcare, that we focus too much on cure and not enough on care. That has driven people to seek mind-body approaches. This is a recent review from the National Health Statistic Reports showing that 38.1 million adults made an average of 10 visits per person to practitioners of complementary and alternative treatments at a total cost of $33.9 billion. People are spending more money out of pocket on mind, body, and other integrative medicine approaches than they are out of pocket on mainstream medical care. So there's a tremendous push from patients who are seeking something that they're not getting, despite all of the tremendous advances in high-tech medicine that you've been learning about in these courses. So it suggests that something is missing. Now, I think part of what's missing is the fact that we had a much better capitalist system of healthcare 50 years ago, when if you wanted medical care, you bought it, you paid for it, and you chose what you got. And the only part of the healthcare system where that works now is in the alternative medicine system, where if you want it, you choose it, you buy it, you pay for it, and if you don't like it, you don't pay for it. People have more control over their alternative healthcare than they do over their mainstream healthcare, and that's one reason they use it. But they're also seeking a kind of support and control in dealing with their illness that we tend not to give them in modern healthcare. So what I hope to do is give you some examples of how we can help people better manage themselves, manage their bodies, and deal with their illnesses. And there'll be 3 examples I'll give you. One involves hypnosis, a technique I'll call Tranceformation, stress support in cancer, and then I'll talk a little bit about integrative medicine here at Stanford. So there has been growing interest in the role of hypnosis in medical care. This is from Time magazine a couple years ago. And they point out, hypnosis itself I think of as something like the oldest profession. Everybody's interested in it, but nobody wants to be seen in public with it. And it has gone through one rejection after another. Freud used hypnosis when he first started psychoanalysis and quickly gave it up when a patient became infatuated with him, and he actually wrote in his autobiography, I was relieving this woman of her attacks of pain by using hypnosis to trace them back to their traumatic origins, and she threw her arms around my neck. He said, I was modest enough not to attribute this event to my own irresistible personal attractiveness. So Freud discovered transference, that patients have feelings about their doctors that may have something to do with someone other than them, and he abandoned hypnosis. Another example of the abandonment of hypnosis, this very powerful mind-body technique, is a young woman suffered from spinal weakness. She had to be carried from room to room by her father. And this happened through her adolescence, through her marriage, and only when she became pregnant did she decide she needed treatment. So she went to see a follower of Mesmer's, who was the founder of hypnosis, named Phineas T. Quinby, who used animal magnetism to cure her. And she was thrilled, she was walking, she didn't have the spinal weakness. 5 years later, they corresponded. Some say there was some closer involvement between the two of them. She got a letter announcing that he had died suddenly, and the next day she slipped on the ice, she re-injured her back, and she went into a period of mourning and meditation and decided that it was not actually animal magnetism that had cured her, it was the Word of God. Does anybody know who this woman is? That's right, it was Mary Baker Eddy. It was the beginning of Christian Science. And to this day, you can't mention hypnosis around a Christian Scientist. I was visiting the Mother Church back in Boston, which is an amazing place. It's like 1,000 people can stand up and give testimony to one another. And this woman was very nice, showing us around until she found out we were there from a hypnosis meeting. And she couldn't get us out of there fast enough. And the lesson for the day was hypnotism alias necromancy, denounced, loving the dead, that's what they call it. So you can't mention hypnosis around a Christian Scientist. So the tradition is there, but it keeps getting rejected. Mesmer was an 18th century Viennese physician who made quite a name for himself by inducing these altered mental states. And if you look at healing ceremonies around the world, a key element in the healing ceremony is inducing an altered mental state. Now, the interesting thing is that in the West, when we do it, we put the patient into the altered mental state. In the East, it's the healer, the shaman, who goes into the altered mental state. And I actually had a wonderful medical student here years ago, Amiteva Biswas, who went to Nepal for the summer, and I taught him how to measure hypnotizability. And he measured the hypnotizability of hundreds of Nepalese. And what we found was that the ones who chose to go to the native healers were more hypnotizable than the ones who went to the Western medical clinics. So they selected themselves for their ability to alter their mental states. So Mesmer, he got popular, he left his wife and family in Vienna and moved to Paris, where he quickly outcompeted the French physicians of the 18th century. Now, I ask you this, If you had if you had a randomized study in which you've learned about randomized trials, in which you sent every other medically ill patient to Mesmer to induce an altered mental state, or to a French physician, how many think Mesmer's patients would have done better, medically ill? How many think the French physician's patients would have done better? Well, the first group is right. You know why? Sorry? Bloodletting. The major treatment was bloodletting. Voltaire wrote to his brother, "We did everything we could to save father's life. We even sent the doctors away." And unless you happen to have congestive heart failure or polycythemia vera, you are more likely to be killed than helped by going to a doctor. This did not endear Mesmer to his colleagues in medicine. So he was investigated by a French panel of experts that included our own Benjamin Franklin, who was having a great time in Paris, the famous chemist Lavoisier, and a doctor well known for his work in pain control. His name was Guillotin. He kind of created the mind-body problem. And they concluded that what Mesmer was doing was nothing but heated imagination, which actually was probably true, but heated imagination is a powerful thing. And one sad footnote is that every member of that commission, except Franklin, actually died on the guillotine, so it was a dangerous time. Mesmer would have these paquets in which they would have weak magnetic fields and try to influence people's thinking and induce a hypnotic trance. You don't need any of this to do it. There are risks to animal magnetism, though, so don't say I didn't warn you. So what is hypnosis? Well, how many of you have been hypnotized? Any of you? Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. There's a substantial amount of experience here. I think of hypnosis as a state of aroused, attentive focal concentration with a relative constriction of peripheral awareness. So hypnosis is to consciousness what looking through a telephoto lens is to a camera. You see what you see with great detail, but you're less aware of the context of the surroundings. So this profound absorption is a part of hypnotizability. And the people who are more hypnotizable tend to use it all the time. So how many of you have had the experience in a movie of getting so caught up in the movie that you forget you're watching the movie, you enter the imagined world? How many of you have that? How many of you have never had that experience? You don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, so it's about half and half, and you guys can leave now. In fact, that's associated with a trait called absorption, the tendency to lose yourself, to have self-altering experiences. And the first group of you are more hypnotizable than the second. And hypnotizability is a very stable trait. People have it, it's as stable as IQ throughout adult life. So those people who have it get fully absorbed in what they're attending to. And then there are two other things that go along with it. One is what we call dissociation. So it means that you put out of consciousness things that would ordinarily be in consciousness. Now our brains process vast amounts of information automatically. The brain is a huge information processor. But the things we're aware of, when we're thinking, reflecting, making choices, that system is a much more energetically expensive system, and it can manage only about 7 plus or minus 2 things at a time. The famous experimental psychologist George Miller wrote a paper called The Magical Number 7 plus or minus 2, and he didn't like magic. So the fact that he used that word caught people's attention. And what he was saying is that in every study of working memory and attention, you can remember between 5 and 9 things, which was actually how Bell Labs came up with the number of digits in a phone number, that you could remember about 7. 10 is kind of pushing it for us, and that's why we all have them recorded on cell phones and don't know our own home number anymore. So in hypnosis, you're down at the lower end. You're focusing on fewer things. You put out of consciousness things that would be in consciousness. And is this a kind of weird thing? Well, let's do a little experiment. Right now, you're having sensations in your bottoms touching these wonderful chairs the school has provided for you. Hopefully those sensations were not foremost in your mind at the time I brought it up, or if they were, you could leave now. So all the time we're deciding to pay attention to some things and put out of conscious awareness others. Hypnosis is a more extreme form of doing that. Now the third thing that happens with hypnosis is what's been called suggestibility. The idea that you will just rotely go ahead and do anything anyone tells you to do when you're in this altered state. And when my patients used to anxiously ask my father, he was a psychiatrist who practiced hypnosis since World War II, they'd ask him nervously, "Can you hypnotize me and make me do anything you want?" And he would say to them, "If I had that much power, do you think I'd be wasting my time sitting here talking to you?" So he converted anxiety into anger that way. And on the one hand, no, you can't, people can refuse to do something suggested to them. On the other hand, I think we've all had that it seemed like a good idea at the time experience where you thought, what was I thinking when I went along with that? So in order to make judgments, you have to compare and contrast. You have to be in a frame of mind where you're thinking about the implications. AA calls it thinking through that next drink. Think through what it means if you do it. And if you're in a kind of frame of mind where you're less likely to critically judge and evaluate, you're more likely to do it and worry about it later. And that does happen in hypnosis. So while anybody can refuse to do something, it is the case that people who are hypnotized are more likely to go along. Now, there are sort of dark implications of that if it's misused. On the other hand, there are positive therapeutic applications. A lot of people have a million ways of defeating the cleverest therapeutic strategy you've just cooked up. And if they're in a state in which they're less likely to do that, they're more likely to go along with and act upon the instruction you give. So this altered mental state can get people to focus intently on a good therapeutic strategy, to put outside of awareness things like pain that they just as soon not pay so much attention to, and to give up their habitual ways of defeating efforts to get them better. So I'm going to show you some examples of that. In a sense, hypnosis gets us to reverse the way in which we usually use our brain. And I'll give you an example of this. Typically in ordinary consciousness, for example, we respond to perceptions and manipulate language. And we're doing that right now. I'm manipulating language, you're responding to perception. So I'm in a more active mode, you're in a more passive mode. If you look at the brain, one really simplistic way of thinking about the brain is just divide it front and back, okay? And in the precentral area here, you have most of the parts of the brain that enable us to enact things upon the world. You have the motor cortex here, you have the frontal lobes, where we make decisions and plan what we're going to do, and you have the anterior part of the temporal lobe, which is where the speech centers are. The back part of the brain is the sensory receptive part of the brain. So you have this huge occipital cortex where we process visual information, somatosensory cortex here, and auditory cortex here in the posterior part of the temporal lobe. So the back part of the brain is where we respond to the world. The front part is where we act on the world. And what you do in hypnosis is you invert that a bit, because in hypnosis, we respond to language rather than use it to change the world, and we can manipulate perception. So we take a more active stance about parts of our experience in which we're usually pretty passive. And that's one of the things that I think makes hypnosis such an interesting phenomenon. Now you may wonder, why on earth would humans be evolved to do that? Well, think about the fact from an evolutionary point of view that as physical creatures, we're pathetic. You know, we're not very big, we're not very fast. Eagles see better than we do, dogs hear and smell better than we do. And about the only sort of physical advantage we have on the animal kingdom is the opposing thumb, which is a good thing, but you know, it's got its limits. So what that means is that we're more often creatures of prey, and the way prey detect their victims is motion. So if you've evolved in such a way that even if you're scared or hurt, you can put out of awareness things that would tend to stir you up and keep yourself still, you have a better chance of surviving. So there's a lot of evolutionary theory that thinks we have evolved these states of consciousness to help ourselves survive in situations where we otherwise might not. So this is another example of exactly that. So how can you get through your medical care being treated like Saint Sebastian and still have a smiley face? Well, I'll give you a number of examples of that, how we've used hypnosis to do this. So, you know, we tend to think in a very bottom-up way about things like pain perception, for example. Have you ever had the experience of stubbing your toe on a door frame or something, and you think, oh God, this is going to hurt? And it takes about, you know, 2 or 3 seconds, and then it hurts. Well, now, why the delay? The reason is that there are 2 peripheral neural systems that transmit information. And one are these large alpha fibers that are well myelinated. You've heard about myelinated neurons and things like that. Well, anyhow, they speed conduction of impulses, and they detect position and vibration. And so when you juxtapose your toe with a hard object, you know right away you've done it, because the position sense gets to your brain quickly. The fibers that carry pain perception are smaller, they're not well myelinated, and they conduct impulses more slowly, and they go by a different path, what's called the lateral spinal thalamic tract, up to the thalamus and the periaqueductal gray in the brain. And so that's the second signal that gets to you. We tend to think that the amount of pain we feel is just the product of all of this noxious input that comes up. But for decades, there has been research that shows that in fact pain is a bidirectional experience and that we can alter our perception of pain. Even Pavlov noted this, that after a while you give the same shock to a dog and they stop reacting to it. That the downward input from the cortex can actually modulate the amount of pain you feel. The way you can remember that is that the strain in pain lies mainly in the brain. You have to pay attention to pain for it to hurt. And here's an example of that. See, here's the pain stimulus. Little Mary here looks kind of interested, actually, and her father is in terrible pain. So, and you know, many of us know athletes who broke their ankle in the second quarter of a football game and didn't know they were hurt until, you know, halftime or something when somebody said, "What's wrong with your ankle?" Pain is a combination of the physical input and the amount of attention you pay to it. But pain can hijack attention. So let me give you some examples of how we can use hypnosis to help people deal with it. And I'll just tell you one case example before I tell you the study. I was called by a famous oncologist here to see a young man who was a world-class swimmer who nearly died one night. He bled out. He had a grapefruit-sized lymphoma. That's a white blood cell tumor in his gut. And he nearly died. They brought him in the hospital and started him on chemotherapy. And he was literally climbing the walls. I mean, literally, he was in so much pain, he couldn't stand it. His parents were afraid he was becoming a drug addict. And so when they run out of things to do, that's when they call me. So the drugs weren't working, so get Spiegel in here. So I told the parents, I'm not worried about drug addiction. That's low on my list. Let me deal with him. So I go in the room. This huge strapping guy is struggling on the bed, moaning and screaming. And I said to him, trying to establish rapport, we learned that in psychiatry, I said, you don't really want to be here, do you? And he said, how many years of medical training did it take you to figure that out? So I could see we were getting along very well. And I said, well, where would you rather be? And he said, well, you know, I'm a great swimmer, but I've never surfed. And I said, okay, we're going to Hawaii. So I got him hypnotized, and I told him to imagine that he was surfing. And he kept groaning, but the groan changed a little bit. And I said, what happened? And he said, well, I fell off the surfboard. And I said, good, well, get on it and do it right. So I got him practicing surfing. Just don't be here. Go somewhere else where you'd rather be. 48 hours later, I was back on the unit. He was in the hall in bear claw slippers, chasing the nurses up and down the hall. He was off his pain meds. And I got to the note from this famous oncologist who wrote, patient off of pain meds, tumor must be regressing. So, you know, we're sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of medicine. You know, we don't get no respect. This is a paper that we published in The Lancet in 2000. Elvira Lang, who was a radiologist here, is now at Harvard, and I built up a collaboration over a number of years. And it's one of the wonderful things at Stanford, where there's just terrific people around that you can build research collaborations with. And she came to me to learn to use hypnosis, what she called allodyne imagery, but is hypnosis, to help patients who were going through invasive radiological procedures. Now, these are procedures where they do arterial cut downs, they thread little cameras to visualize the constriction in the renal artery or to do embolization of tumors in the liver and elsewhere. And you don't use general anesthesia. It's a lengthy procedure, 2 to 3 hours often. There is substantial pain and anxiety involved with it. So we randomized patients to 3 conditions. One, standard care. All the patients had IVs, and they could push a button and get what's called patient-controlled analgesia, so they could give themselves a dose of opiates. Another third had that plus structured attention, so they had a kindly nurse who was there just kind of holding their hand and helping them. And the third group was taught self-hypnosis to do the kinds of things I'm talking about here, where you imagine that the part of your body that hurts is cooler or warmer, or you just go somewhere else, or you focus on sensations in another part of your body. But you use this constriction of attention to focus on something else and filter the hurt out of the pain. So these were the 3 conditions, and here's what happened. You see here the pain scores on a 0 to 10 scale. And one of the things, it's very important, if you're in pain, make sure your doctor asks you to rate your pain on a 0 to 10 scale. It's very hard to communicate how much pain you're in. And either people overmodulate and say, I'm fine when I'm not, or they undermodulate and they rant and rave, and then people don't take them seriously either. So using a numerical scale like this is very helpful. So these patients rated their pain, and you can see that by the second hour, the standard care patients were starting to lose it. Their pain was going up and up. It was 6 out of 10-point scale. By the third hour, it was 7.5. So they're getting worse and worse despite giving themselves considerable amount of analgesic medication. The ones who were getting the supportive care were staying about the same. They were doing okay. The hypnosis patients were actually reporting less and less pain as time went on. So it was down to 1 by 2.5 hours after the study had begun. The anxiety scores actually started to worry me because, again, the standard care patients are getting more and more anxious. The ones with the nurse paying attention to them were staying about the same, and I was afraid the hypnosis patients had all died because they had no anxiety at all by the end of 2 hours. They were doing fine. So you see dramatic differences over time in the pain and anxiety these patients felt, all undergoing the same kinds of medical procedures. And the interesting thing is that the hypnosis patients were using half as much medication, half as much pain medication as the other groups were. So they had less pain, less anxiety, and used less medication, and the procedures on average took 17 minutes less time. So, and part of it was less wear and tear on the medical staff, who didn't feel that they were causing all kinds of pain to the patients. It turns out actually that even adding the extra personnel to do the study, you saved an average of $348 a procedure because there were fewer complications and it took less time to do the procedure. There was far less problems with oversedation, with problems with blood pressure in the hypnosis group than there were in the other two groups. So this was a situation in which a very simple, straightforward intervention helped people get through the procedure quicker, more safely, and with less pain and anxiety. Now, when I said the Rodney Dangerfield of medicine, if you had a drug that did this, I can assure you that by now every hospital in the world would be using it. This wasn't a drug. This was teaching patients self-hypnosis, published in one of the best medical journals. People are starting to use it. There's more use of it, but it is anything but standard care. I'll give you another example. This is my daughter Julia drew this when she was a good deal younger. She said, "My dad hypnotizes people and makes them want to live longer," and you see a particularly successful clinical example here. And Julia, who's now a student in law school, says, "Dad, are you still showing that thing?" And I said, so I have to tell you that this doesn't represent her current level of artistic ability. I was getting calls from Packard Hospital that they were having physical struggles with 8-year-old girls in the radiology suite. And could I help them deal with it? So I thought, well, yes, this is worth looking into. And it involved what's called voiding cystourethograms. And these are studies where you have to stick a catheter in through the penis or the urethra into the bladder, instill it with radio-opaque dye, and then have the child void to see whether there's backflow up into the kidneys. Because the bladder and the ureters that go into the bladder are actually very cleverly designed most of the time. And that is, if your bladder is like this, nice and round, your ureter goes in like this. And what that means is that when you start to urinate, it naturally closes the ureter. It's a natural valve so that you don't get pushback of the urine into the kidney. But some children are born with it perpendicular, and that means there is pushback, and you can lose your kidney. So you have to image them every year and see whether they're going to grow out of it naturally, or you have to do major surgery. The kids remember this, and sometimes the parents lie to the kids and say, "We're going out for an ice cream," and the next thing you know, they're in the hospital with strangers doing this to them. It isn't good. So we got them. I would see the child and the mother a week before the procedure. I'd hypnotize the child and have them, I'd say, "Where would you rather be?" And so they would be Disneyland or playing with a friend or in a park. And we'd make a list, and the mother would practice with the child every night. And when we got to the suite, the mother would be behind the head, I'd be by the right shoulder, and between us, we would keep the child distracted doing self-hypnosis. We now have developed some DVDs that we give to parents to help them do it. And so we had a randomized study where half the kids got routine care and half got this self-hypnosis training. And you can see that there was significantly less crying during the procedure. And we had them rate how uncomfortable and unhappy they were. The children reported less distress, particularly during the catheter preparation, which is the worst time, and inserting the catheter. The techs who were there the whole time thought it was twice as easy to do the procedures. And again, that's 17 minutes. It took 17 minutes less time per procedure to do it, and that's a long 17 minutes with an 8-year-old in a radiology suite. So again, we were able to show and publish in Pediatrics that simple self-hypnosis can make a huge difference in how comfortable it is for children to go through these procedures. Now I'll give you a third example of how we've learned to use hypnosis. This is the smoking gun. And we know that smoking is a major public health problem. I think it's really remarkable that there are whole industries devoted to getting people hooked on substances that have no real virtue except to kill you with emphysema or lung cancer, not to mention the effects on your children. And so we developed a technique, and my dad was a pioneer in this area. It was a very simple self-hypnosis technique. A lot of people say, you know, I want to start, smoking at least gives me an opportunity to take a few minutes for myself. Now, of course, you're putting poison in your lungs while you're doing it, but, you know. So I say, well, you know what? You can feel good, take a few deep breaths, teach your body to float without poisoning yourself at the same time. That's called self-hypnosis. So we teach them to do self-hypnosis and concentrate on 3 points. For my body, smoking's a poison. I need my body to live. I owe my body respect and protection. So you focus on what you're for, on thinking of your body as if it were a trusting, innocent child, and protecting it from damage rather than being against smoking. You know, and one thing that people who use hypnosis are pretty good at is figuring out what not to say to patients. You know, try this, try not thinking about purple elephants. You know, don't think about purple elephants. Well, what are you doing? You know, you're thinking about it. If you tell somebody don't do something, you're actually forcing them to be tempted to do it. And instead, we're saying focus on what you're for, not what you're against, and hook in your behavior about smoking to all the other sensible things you do, like buckle your seatbelts and look both ways when you cross the street and eat carefully and all that. So you connect it with a network of associations that help people to focus on this. And I have to tell you one other story about my dad. There was an article in the Times about him and the Wall Street Journal and a blog. People started collecting stories about him. And one guy said, I went to see Herbert Spiegel 20 years ago. And I'd been smoking for 8 years. I couldn't stop. And he put some headphones on and he said some things to me. And I left his office and I lit up a cigarette and it tasted just as good as it had before. And I thought I just wasted $200. He said, that was the last cigarette I've smoked in 20 years. He said, I don't know what he did to me, but it stopped. And as a matter of fact, we get half of the people we see for just one session to stop, and half of them will not touch a cigarette in 2 years. So if they have a single cigarette, it's classed as a failure. So it's not bad. I figure that's the best use of my clinical time that I make. If I can get 1 out of 4 people never to smoke again, teaching them self-hypnosis, I'm happy. So these are some examples of how hypnosis can help people, how you can use the mind to influence our brain and behavior, change the way we process pain and change some of our behavior. And there are lots of other examples of this too. I want to take a few minutes to talk about what's going on in the brain when people are hypnotized, and that's an area where we're doing active research now. One region of the brain that our studies and others have shown seems to be heavily involved in hypnosis is the anterior cingulate cortex. So here's a cerebellum back here. This person is looking to the right. So the cingulate cortex lies between the limbic system, the emotional and memory basal part of the brain, and the frontal cortex here, where we think and plan. So it kind of translates information from our thinking to our feeling, and it also helps us to focus attention. It's a context generator. So when you're on the horns of a dilemma, when you're trying to detect where the road is to turn on a dark night, your anterior cingulate gyrus is working very hard. And so it seems to be involved in hypnosis, where you're focusing attention. And it is also a place where we process pain. And I'm going to show you some interesting data about hypnosis and pain in the brain in just a minute. There's another part of the brain that we're finding is involved, and that's called the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. That's right up about here. It's a part of the brain that causes us to stop and think. So when you inhibit activity and you say, what's going on, your ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is involved, and that seems to be involved in hypnosis as well. Now, for many decades, we've been doing experiments looking at the relationship between hypnosis and perception. And one of the lessons we've learned, you would tend to think that since hypnosis is just this sort of talky treatment, that you wouldn't actually change the way the brain processes information, but you might change the way people react to the information. And our research and that of others shows that that's not the case. So one of the studies I was able to do quite a while ago with Carl Pribram when he was here at Stanford, and he was very welcoming and helped me use his laboratory and use EEG, is we measured what's called an evoked response. Now this is just an EEG that is time-locked to a series of stimuli. So you're recording electrical activity from the brain on the scalp, on the surface of the scalp, time-locked to giving stimuli. In this case, it was an electric shock to the wrist. And you record how the brain responds to this series of 50 or 70 shocks. And the red line is a normal response. So you see here, this is called P100, P200, P300, and this is the classical response of the brain to a sensory perception. The P300 is mostly influenced by surprise. If you're surprised by a stimulus, the P300 will get bigger. The P100 is largely a reaction to just the strength of the stimulus itself. It's just a tenth of a second, very fast brain reaction. The yellow line represents people receiving the same shock, only they were hypnotized, and I told them your hand is cold and numb. It's in ice water. Cool, tingling numbness, you won't feel anything. And what you see are some really marked changes in the evoked response. The P100 disappeared, which is really still surprising to me, that it was that powerful. The brain just acted as though it was not sensing that stimulus, and the P300 was only half as big. So the brain reset the gain and decided it wasn't feeling what in fact it was being presented with. I was talking with a colleague of mine, and I know you had a lecture with Dr. Schatz on seeing is believing. Well, I'm going to do the flip side of that, which is believing is seeing, that if you think something intensely enough, you will see it differently. And I was talking with a colleague of mine at Harvard, Steve Koslin, who is a very tough experimental psychologist, and who said, well, you know, this stuff you've been doing is interesting, but maybe people are just shutting down and they're not responding. So I said, okay, well, what would be an experiment you would believe? And he was very much into visual imagery. So he said, I want people to have to look at things but change what they're seeing. And let's see if there's a difference. So we got a series of highly hypnotizable subjects, and we put them in a PET scanner. And you can detect either glucose metabolism or blood flow. We were looking at blood flow here, and this shows the regions of the brain that respond to color perception. So we took them, this is the difference between looking at color and looking at black and white, and these were the regions that do that processing. So then we hypnotized them, and we told them in one condition to drain the color out of the color grid, and in the other to add color to a black and white grid. So they were doing in hypnosis kind of what you're doing now, seeing it change from one to the other. And in those conditions, when they were looking at black and white but thought it was color, there was a significant increase in blood flow in the color processing regions of their brains. And when they were looking at color and thought it was black and white, there was a significant decrease in blood flow in those regions. So that's why I call it believing is seeing, that in fact, if they thought they were looking at color, their brain responded as if it were color. So we have much more ability to alter perception in our brains than we give ourselves credit for. This is another example done by a wonderful group in Montreal, Pierre Rainville and colleagues. And what's cool about this study was that he hypnotized two groups of subjects and gave them analgesia instructions, reduce pain, but he just changed the language that he used, and he got very different results. So in one condition, he did what I did in the evoked potential study. He just said, your hand is cool and numb, and you'll feel very little of sensation. They got reduced pain, and the reduction here was in the somatosensory cortex. So it's the back, just in the post-central gyrus area where we tend to process sensation. And that's where the big difference was. So here you see the difference between increased and decreased pain. If he did the same thing, except now he said, the pain is there, but it won't bother you. That's the only difference, was the words he used. They also got a reduction in pain, but now it was that anterior cingulate gyrus where you saw the difference. And there were no differences in somatosensory cortex. So just changing the language you use changes the parts of the brain that people used in developing hypnotic analgesia. So the parts of the brain that we think are involved are this anterior cingulate here, which helps us to focus attention, frontal cortex as well. You see here the limbic system and the amygdala and the hippocampus where we process memory and emotion. And it's a region of the brain that mediates between our emotion system and our thinking system and seems to be powerfully involved in hypnosis. And with a group of colleagues here now, Fumiko Heft, Alan Rees in psychiatry, two colleagues who were at Stanford and are now at MIT, Susan Whitfield Gabrielli, John Gabrielli, Mike Grecius in neurology, Vinod Menon in psychiatry, and I have been looking at the neural basis of hypnotizability. So what distinguishes people who are high and low in hypnotizability? We know it's a stable trait. So if you're hypnotized, if you're a 9 on a 10-point scale when you're 21, you're going to be a 9 when you're 54. It's as stable as IQ. It's a very stable trait. And so we looked at differences in what we call functional connectivity. which parts of the brain co-activate during certain tasks in high and low hypnotizables. And I won't go into great detail, but I'll just tell you that in a condition where we're looking at a network that's involved in trying to figure out what to do next, so you're concerned about the next task that you have to engage in, we found that the anterior cingulate cortex functional connectivity was higher in high hypnotizables than in lows. So I'll show it to you here in a simpler diagram. So basically, there's growing evidence that this part of the brain that helps us focus attention is activated in hypnosis. And now with members of this group, we've got new funding, and I'm here to tell you the stimulus grants were a great thing. Thank you, President Obama. We got funding. And we're now examining the neural signature of the hypnotic trance, which is something that so far has eluded researchers, but we think we've got a chance to get it. So that's what we're working on. Now, many people think of placebos when they think of hypnosis, and the word placebo actually is from the Latin "I will please." That's what it means. Many people are sort of contemptuous of placebos, but actually they're very powerful. In fact, I was at a meeting on the placebo at NIH, and people from Big Pharma were there, and they were tearing their hair out because you may have seen an article in Newsweek a couple of weeks ago about how there's a researcher in England named Kirsch who thinks that the effects of antidepressants are really all placebo effects. Now they're not, but what has happened is this: 10, 15 years ago, when the newer antidepressants started to be used, about 2/3 of patients would get better, right? But half of those would get better with a placebo. So it was about 30% placebo, 30% antidepressant, and 30% no response. What's happened is, as people get more and more convinced that antidepressants really work, the placebo rate is going up and the pharmacologic rate is not. So it's now like 45 or 50% are responding to placebos and only 10 to 15 are responding to pharmacologic effects. Now, it tends to be people with the most severe depression, and it doesn't mean antidepressants don't work, but it means actually that the placebo is a powerful thing. And we ought to think more about the words we say to patients, because they have a tremendous influence on what happens to them. That can be a good thing. You have a question in the back? Yeah, go ahead.
I just had a question. Do you think that the placebo effect is, I guess, showing progress because those people really have a desire to get better as opposed to the people who are on pharmacological medicines who may not have that same desire?
Well, no, in those studies, everybody is in what's called a randomized trial. So it's the same population of people. They're all saying, I want treatment. They don't know whether they're getting a placebo or the real drug. But in your question, what I think you're right about is that what's happened is people's general conviction that taking these drugs is going to get me better has strengthened. And so that means more of them are responding just to the expectation and less to the pharmacology, is what I think is happening. Now, there were a lot of articles in medical journals in the late 19th century about tomato poisoning. And there were many admissions to hospitals and emergency rooms for the results of tomato poisoning because it was widely believed that tomatoes were a poisonous fruit. And so people got sick. They would eat a tomato, they'd start to throw up, they'd feel terrible. That's a negative placebo effect, or what's called a nocebo effect. And so expectation can work in either way. You know, it can make you feel better, but it can also make you feel worse. And there are times, you know, as a physician, I have to warn patients about all of the serious side effects of medications and also most of the common side effects, even if they're not so serious. I'm sure that in a certain proportion of my patients, I'm giving them a nocebo message that they're going to get sick. And some people actually think the drug is more effective if they feel the effect in some way. But the placebo is a powerful thing. There are groups now that are able to show what's going on in the brain, frontal cortex to periaqueductal gray activation in pain control with placebo, which is the best established use of placebos. But words and suggestion, and even in a non-hypnotic context, are a powerful therapeutic tool, but can also cause mischief. Phil, yeah.
Just comment about placebos and non-psychological effects. They can affect physiological.
Oh, yes. What Dr. Pizzo is saying is that they can have physiological effects, not just psychological effects. That's absolutely right, and I'll show some examples of that. But this isn't just a matter of feeling worse or feeling more pain. It can change heart rate, blood pressure, it can change gastrointestinal motility. There are all kinds of real, you know, think about it. Our body is complicated, but our brain is very complicated, and it runs the show. And so there's no reason why the information we process shouldn't have effects through the nervous system on the way the rest of our body functions. And placebos are a powerful example of exactly that. So they have medical consequences. I mean, the extreme example of the nocebo effect, you may have seen these, there's a phenomenon among some tribes called boning. When they choose somebody who's considered an unacceptable person for having transgressed some social norm, they'll just stand him over there and take this sacred bone and point it at him, and he falls over dead. I've seen films of this. You know, it's probably a cardiac arrhythmia. But that is the extreme of the nocebo effect, where you just say, I think you're going to die, and they do. So it can have powerful medical consequences. This is from a study in which they basically looked at placebo versus hypnotic analgesia in high and low hypnotizable subjects. And the bottom line here is that what they found was, oh, here we go, I'm using the wrong thing, that high hypnotizables got much, here's the placebo level of effect here. This is the placebo analgesia. And here, you see among the low hypnotizables, the level of analgesia, the level of analgesia was the same for hypnosis as it was for placebo here for the low hypnotizables. But for the high hypnotizables, they got much more analgesia, much more pain reduction in hypnosis than they did placebo. So placebo is a part of hypnosis, but hypnosis is a much more powerful way of controlling pain. And here's an example of what Dean Pizzo was talking about. This involves hypnosis. We hypnotized people and had them eat an imaginary meal. And this was like at 7 in the morning. They had to be NPO, you know, no food to eat, so we could measure their gastric acid secretion. And I hadn't had breakfast either. I was hungry. And they were taking for an hour in hypnosis an imaginary gastronomic tour of the Bay Area. One woman after 40 minutes said, "Let's stop, I'm full." And I wasn't. So the first hour was their baseline gastric acid secretion. The second hour was post-hypno eating the imaginary meals. 89% increase in gastric acid secretion, no food. Then, in the next condition, we hypnotized them and said, relax and do anything you want except food or drink. And here we got a 40% decrease in gastric acid secretion. So we could change it in either direction. So then Ken Klein, the gastroenterologist who's working with me, says, well, I want to try the ultimate thing. I want to inject them with pentagastrin, which is a hormone that stimulates gastric acid secretion in the stomach. And so we injected them with pentagastrin and had them relax. And despite that, we got a significant 19% decrease in gastric acid secretion in the relaxation condition. So we could override the effect of the hormone as well. So the brain has powerful effects on the way the body works, and we don't begin to understand the extent to which the brain can control various body functions. And one final example, this is such a nice visual that helps me to illustrate something, a couple of things. One is that people tend to think of hypnosis as doing something to somebody, but actually hypnosis is an occasion to teach people how much more control they can have over their own body. So this gentleman came to see me. He was referred by Bob Chase, wonderful professor of hand surgery here. And he'd been sent to Bob. This was his hand in maximal extension. 2.5 years after an industrial accident. He was a contractor. He was down in Monterey making more money than I was as an assistant professor, and a defective ladder collapsed on his hand. He had a compound fracture of his index finger, and he had terrible pain. It healed very badly, and this was his hand 2.5 years later. And the insurance company was secretly filming him to prove that he could actually use the hand and he was faking it. Now, I wouldn't believe that from a patient, despite the fact that I don't like insurance companies. However, it was in his medical record. They were trying to prove that he could really use the hand. He wasn't. He had lost his job. His wife had left him. He lost his home. He was in terrible shape. He was depressed. He went to a psychologist who thought that this was what you call a conversion symptom. And conversion symptoms happen. There are times when what you think in your mind causes a dysfunction in the body. Examples are what are called pseudo-seizures, where you're stressed and suddenly you start to act as though you have epilepsy, even though there's not a seizure focus in the brain. But any medical problem is always a combination of what's going on in the mind and what's going on in the body. And the dumbest thing you can say to a patient is it's all in your head. You know, because number one, it's never entirely true. You know, I mean, even people with spinal cord injuries rehabilitate differently depending on their attitude and how hard they work at rehabilitation. So there's always a mental component to it. But what's the other reason why telling a patient it's all in their head is a really bad idea? Put yourself in the position of the patient. Why would you not like that?
Because you're marginalizing what they're saying. You're not taking, you're trivializing
Right,
what they're saying.
right. That's part of it, that you're not taking them seriously. There's another reason too. Yes?
I think you may start start feeling low and disappointed. And so your brain will work in the opposite direction of not inspiring, but to be inspiring.
Okay, good. So you're teaching them a failure experience instead of a success experience. That's right. There's another part too. Yes?
Well, it's the patient's fault that
Right.
they're having the problem itself.
Right, right. It's the patient's fault. You're blaming the victim, which we're very good at. Yes. There's another reason though. Yes?
I'll show you it's not all in my head.
Right. Right. So the interpersonal interaction is to get sicker rather than to get better, because what happens if you get better? Exactly. So you humiliate the patient for getting better. That's a really bad thing to do. So I said to him, so he said to me, you know what? This wasn't a fist. He said, I knew I was angry at my employer. This was not news to me. I didn't have to have a conversion symptom. So I said to him, so the insurance company sent him to Bob Chase and said, amputate the index finger. They said, you'll never have a usable hand if we don't do it. And like all good surgeons, Bob said, this is a last resort, not a first. He said, are you willing to try anything? And the guy said, yeah. He said, even going to a psychiatrist. And he hesitated. He said, well, maybe. He said, even one who... said, even one who uses hypnosis. And he said, well, I'll try anything. So he came to see me, and I said to him, you know, I don't know why your hand is like this, and I don't care. Do you want to get better? And he said, yes. And I said, well, we're going to embark on a rehabilitation program. So that meant he could get better without being dishonored. And I said, you have two obvious problems here. You have horrible circulation in your hand. And frankly, if you just held your hand like this for 2.5 years, the circulation wouldn't be good. And he had muscle wasting in his forearm. It was 4 centimeters skinnier than in his right arm. So he lost muscle mass and he lost circulation. So I said, you're going to develop some tremors in your hand. And they're going to build up the blood flow and the muscle mass. And so he sat there for a half an hour in my office with his hand shaking like this, sweat pouring off his forehead. And I thought, this is not somebody who's not motivated to get better. So in 3 months, half an hour a day, twice a day, he would do this exercise. He had full extension of all the fingers except the originally fractured one. And he actually, we gave him a tennis ball to kind of do some exercise with. He actually ruptured some ligaments. He was trying too hard. We had to tell him to slow down, not so fast. And Bob put a dynamic splint on the originally injured finger. And so now, 11 months later, he had virtually full extension of the hand. And he came into the clinic carrying a 35-pound brick. And the secretary was afraid he was going to throw it through the window or something. He said, Doc, I can hold a brick again. I can go back to work. And so he put his union card on top of the brick, and I signed it. He had to sue the insurance company to take him off disability. They would not believe now that his hand was actually working. And he could actually make a real fist this time. And I have a publication with Bob Chase in the Journal of Hand Surgery that I'm proud of. He actually is now back at work making more money again than I am. And I used to bring him in to teach the medical students, and he would get impatient listening to me explain all this stuff. And he would say, Doc, when do I get to show them what I did? So he didn't feel that I had put the whammy on him. He felt that he had earned his way out of this, which he did. And so he's back at work. So here's the problem of saying it's all in your head. Here lies Harold Gordon Maxfield. See, it wasn't psychosomatic. So that's what you were suggesting before. So I'd like to turn now to the other thing that Dean Pizzo mentioned, which is my work with stress support and cancer. Yes? You have a question?
Maybe just be right time to ask at the end of this section.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead. Sure.
About nitrous oxide. I think it is the most wonderful thing for when I have oral surgery. I'm like, sure, bring it on. And I thought of that when you talked about the difference between pain and between hurting and feels like it hurt.
Yeah.
No, maybe that's not how you said it.
Yeah, sensation and suffering. Yeah.
I know it hurt. I mean, there's pain, but it doesn't hurt.
Right.
People told me that's impossible, that you feel the pain, but it doesn't hurt. So I thought maybe you could address which part of the brain used it, or whether it's
Yeah.
the up part and the down part. And why won't they use it for other procedures like thyroid biopsies?
Well, you know, there's always a risk-benefit ratio, and anytime you mess with consciousness, bad things can happen. You know, people can, for example, get nauseated and throw up, and then inhale some of the food if they're not fully conscious. So we tend to avoid reducing consciousness except for really serious situations where you have to prepare more, you have to have more emergency equipment available. Nitrous is pretty good. It tends to give you exactly that sense. It's like opiates do this too, where you know the pain is there, but it just doesn't bother you very much. And so there are times, typically with thyroid biopsies, you know, a little local injection is usually enough to avoid the discomfort, but not for some people. But frankly, what I would like to see is more use of teaching people self-hypnosis to manage the pain, because as I showed you earlier, it is very effective, it doesn't take long to do, and it can really help with the discomfort. Yes?
Does hypnosis work in childbirth?
I'm here to tell you it does. My wife, Helen Blau, is a professor of molecular micro and immunology here at Stanford, runs the Baxter Laboratory, does stem cell research. We have 2 children, and we decided that we would use self-hypnosis rather than epidurals for the delivery. And Daniel was 10 pounds when he was born. He was the first child. He's now 6'4". He's very large. And halfway through her 8-hour labor, she said to me, David, you know, I'm a pharmacologist too. There are drugs for this. and I said, deep breath, you're floating in Lake Tahoe, cool, tingling. And Daniel was born fine, and I had no pain at all. So. And our daughter Julia was born in 4 hours of labor, very little pain, all self-hypnosis. So the answer is yes, it works. Yes, in the back
I
there.
have a question about language.
Yeah.
Do we process language in the same parts of the brain independent of the language we are speaking?
Yes, pretty much that's the case. We have one language center, Wernicke's and Broca's area, usually in the left temporal lobe, some in the right as well. But yes, it doesn't depend on the language. Yes.
2 things. One, I read in, I guess it was Newsweek or Time where medical records got switched, and someone who was told that he had cancer that was inoperable and had 2 weeks to live. And in 2 weeks he passed away, and then the doctor realized that he was given the wrong diagnosis. So talk about mind-body thing. But my question really is, when you're talking about hypnosis, it also sounded like meditation to me, you know, going to another spot and you know, feeling better in that area. So I'm wondering if you see much difference in that.
Well, I've asked this a lot, and I have colleagues who are experienced meditators, and I think probably the mental state you get into, particularly if you're highly hypnotizable when you're meditating, is pretty similar. But the ceremony surrounding it is very different. Hypnosis is much more Western-oriented. It's problem-focused. You use it to focus on a problem and alter your perception. Almost by design, the Eastern approaches are non-problem focused. So the ceremony involves doing your mantra or doing a body scan or something. I think you're in an altered mental state that isn't too different, but you're not trying to solve a problem. You're trying to just live in the moment and focus on your breathing, and then let the problems kind of take care of themselves. So the ceremony is rather different. I suspect that the mental state, and we're actually starting to do some research on that, is pretty similar. Yes?
I was told by a professor at an unnamed medical school about 20 miles north of here that
What could that be?
children under 10 can't receive placebos, or placebos are ineffective on a child under 10. Is that correct?
That's absolutely incorrect. And in fact, the peak period of hypnotizability in the human lifespan is from like 6 to 12. All 8-year-olds are in trances all the time. You know, you call them in for dinner, they don't hear you. So that's a wonderful time, actually, to take advantage of the placebo effect. Yeah. So that's why they're 20 miles to the north. Yes.
Some years ago, I'd been reading about a psychiatrist who used hypnosis, and he put people into hypnosis, into an earlier life that they had experienced.
Yeah.
And somebody who had a problem with their throat and couldn't wear a necklace was hung in an earlier life, which accounted for that deficiency.
Yeah, this is past life regression. My dad used to say, I have enough trouble figuring out what's going on in this life. If you can have vivid fantasies, there's hypnotic age progression too. And so you can have a very vivid fantasy about who you were in a past life. It has nothing to do with the reality of it. So I don't put much stock in it. There was one of these trance channelers years ago, and one of the local TV stations asked me if I could explain it. And I said, well, bring me a high hypnotizable and I'll give you a trance channeler. So Wendy Takuda came down from Channel 4 with a camera crew and brought one of her crewmen who was highly hypnotizable. I hypnotized him and said, there's a spirit inside you, let it speak. And he said, I am Zafra, and I bring a message of peace. And he goes on and on. and I pointed to his boss, and I said, who's that? And he said, wuh, wuh. He couldn't say her name. And I brought him out, I showed him the tape. He thought it was incredible. He couldn't believe he'd said all this stuff. And Wendy DeCuda looked at me and she said, "Doctor, I'm glad that you do what you do and I do what I do and I'm getting out of here." So yeah, it's fantasy, yeah.
Has there been any work done on how hypnosis and people who are hypnotizable and how that works with their sleep and the sleep patterns?
It's an interesting question. I don't. Yeah, yes, I should repeat. Has there been any work on the relationship between hypnotizability and sleep patterns? You know, despite the name hypnos, the common root which means sleep in Greek, hypnosis is not sleep. It's actually a form of highly focused attention. I don't know of many studies on sleep patterns of high versus low hypnotizable. It's a very interesting question. My impression is that highs sleep better than lows. Lows tend to be more anxious and they have trouble turning off their thoughts. And we actually treat people with sleep disturbance by having them just be a traffic director to their thoughts, to project them onto an imaginary screen rather than experiencing them inside their bodies, where they tend to get the sympathetic arousal that keeps them awake. But it's a good question. I don't know of any studies on actual sleep history of high versus low hypnotizables. Yes?
All these wonderful benefits for, in the medical setting for being hypnotized, self-hypnosis, is that available at all to the people who are low hypnotizables?
It's a good question. In general, there's less of it available. I wouldn't say none. And when I find somebody who isn't hypnotizable, I always test them first. I say, well, let's do something else. So I'll do progressive muscle relaxation, or I'll be more likely to prescribe a medication. But interestingly, in this study, in the radiology study I mentioned, we measured hypnotizability, and it was uncorrelated with results. And we think that in really high stress situations like that, whatever ability people have, they use it. So I'd say the more pressure they're under to perform, the more they'll make use of whatever they've got. But there's about a third of the adult population that just aren't meaningfully hypnotizable. Yes? Yep, lady in green.
Are people who follow like charismatic, you might say mesmerizing leaders, rather blindly, tending to be high hypnotized?
Yeah, I think so. I thought for the Jim Jones catastrophe, for example, that a lot of those people probably were. I mean, if you look at these situations, you know, they focus on one thing. The more irrational it is, the better. They suspend critical awareness. They don't focus on contradictory information that might scare them. So it wouldn't surprise me if not everyone, but a substantial proportion are pretty hypnotizable. So it's a vulnerability as well as an asset. Okay, so I think I will now go on and talk some about cancer, and if there are other questions, we can have them. So this lady here raised a very interesting question about this woman who got the wrong diagnosis and was dead in 2 weeks. It's not simply that if you think it's bad in your mind, it'll get bad in your body, or if you wish away your cancer cells, or see your white blood cells killing your cancer cells, the cancer will go away. There was a guy named Simonton who wrote a book called Getting Well Again, in which he wrote that you could just teach people to do that and they'd cure their cancer, which irritated me, and I'll show you what effect it had on my own research. What we're looking at is what are the factors that can influence not just quality of life, but potentially quantity of life with cancer. We think they involve stress history, because then subsequent stressors are more stressful. Depression complicates cancer. Certain genetic vulnerabilities may also make people more vulnerable to the stress-induced effects of cancer. And we think some of the systems, Dean Pizzo mentioned one, the immune system, also the stress hormone system, cortisol and other stress hormones, are factors that may influence the progression of cancer. Cancer is a stressor. This is a dressmaker's maquette that was made by one of my breast cancer patients, who brought it in one day to a group to demonstrate the effects of the cancer on her body, and it is unforgettable. So she had had a modified radical mastectomy, a tram flap reconstruction of her left breast. She had radiation burns. She had a biopsy incision on the other side. And her name, she gave me permission to use her name. Maurice was a Silicon Valley engineer when she started. When she got metastatic disease, she said, you know, all my life I wanted to be an artist. So she quit her job, she went to art school, and she was teaching art by the time she died, and had a beautiful body of art that she'd created. And this was her way of reminding us what it's like to be a cancer patient. So it isn't one big stress, it's a series of stressors. that involve existential issues. You know, half of all people diagnosed with cancer will live to die of something else. But I'm here to tell you that everybody diagnosed with cancer thinks it's going to kill them. So it's an existential challenge for everybody. They have important decisions to make about treatment, reduced physical abilities, there are a change in family roles. So it's an ongoing series of daily stressors that they live with. And there are more and more people living with it. Our success in treating cancer means that while in 1971 there were 3 million cancer survivors, there are now 11 million cancer survivors. So more and more people are living with rather than dying of cancer. It's being converted from what used to be thought of as a terminal illness to a chronic illness like diabetes. You have to live with it, it's serious, but it's not necessarily fatal. Now, one of the mind-body interactions that is dangerous for cancer is depression. And as your level of medical illness increases, the rate of depression increases. So in the general population in this room, 3 or 4% may be or have been depressed at some time. Among medical outpatients, it's 6%, 12% among medical inpatients. About a quarter of cancer patients have significant depression. It's worth noting that those who request assisted suicide, 2/3 of them are depressed. And the thing to do when they're requesting assisted suicide is not kill them, but diagnose and treat their depression, because people get suicidal when they're depressed. Depression can be a very difficult situation because you feel sad, you have negative thoughts about yourself, you remember selectively things you've done wrong. When somebody's depressed, if you tell them 9 good things and 1 bad thing, guess what they're going to remember? They'll remember the 1 bad thing. And one little clinical trick I give the medical students is, if you find yourself getting angry with someone and you don't know why, ask yourself whether they're depressed, because depressed people are irritating. You know, they don't give anything back. You want to shake them by the neck and say, it's not that bad, you know, get a grip. They can't, or they would. So depression damages interpersonal relationships. It tends to get you stuck in this cycle of feeling bad, thinking bad things that only reinforce the bad affect. On top of that, we now have evidence that there are certain genetic differences that make people vulnerable to getting depressed when they're stressed. So this is a paper by Caspi and colleagues published in Science showing that if you have one variant of a gene that codes for what's called the serotonin transporter, that transports serotonin, a neurotransmitter, in the nerve synapse, if you have the short allele of that gene, you're significantly more likely to get depressed when you're stressed 2 or more times. And of course, cancer is a stressor. So there are people with specific genetic vulnerabilities to get depressed when they're stressed. And on top of that, other things start to go wrong. They don't sleep as well. They don't tolerate pain as well, and pain makes them more depressed. So it becomes this reciprocating cycle that can lead them not to cooperate with treatment, to withdraw, and as well have effects on the biology of the disease. So in a recent review we did, we found that depression doesn't have a lot to do with getting cancer, but it seems to have a lot to do with the progression of cancer. So 15 of 24 studies showed that those who were depressed, all other things being equal, would die sooner of cancer. It would progress more rapidly than those who were not depressed. And this is similar to the power of depression in heart disease. We know that people who have heart disease and are depressed are going to die sooner, but somehow cancer seems more mysterious to us than heart disease. This is a drawing of a French breast cancer patient who said the treatment is long and hard to undergo. And the treatments themselves often seem like punishment to patients. You know, if you want patients to love you, be a cardiologist, you know, because you go into the ER, you've got crushing chest pain, you think you're going to die, and 5 minutes later, the pain's gone, you think you're going to live. With oncology, it's exactly the opposite. You know, Dr. Pizzo knows as well. You think you're fine, and there's a lump or a little bleeding or something, and the doctor transforms that into a life threat. And then the treatments make you feel worse than the disease. You know, slash, poison, and burn tends to be the treatment for cancer. So the treatment feels like a punishment to many cancer patients. We find that depression actually predicts poorer outcomes. So this is a study we did here in which we looked at changes in depression over the first year, and we found that those who were getting more depressed lived an average of 3 years. Those who were getting less depressed lived an average of 5 years. And this isn't like getting depressed 2 weeks before you die. This is years before. So depression actually predicts poorer outcome, and many other studies have shown this. And one of the things we're actively investigating is why would that be? What is it about depression that seems to facilitate the more rapid progression of cancer? This was a Dutch breast cancer patient, making a painting about how she was facing her illness itself. And one lesson in this painting is, notice that she's got an umbrella, but it's not open. She's not shielding herself from the confrontation. And that's something I recommend for cancer patients, and I'll show you some examples of that. Another stress-related mind-body interaction is that patients who have suffered significant life reverses are more likely to get breast cancer. Now, this is a complex literature. Some studies show it, some don't. But this is an example, and a particularly good one, involving more than 10,000 patients in Finland. And they found that any single adverse life event increased the risk of getting breast cancer 7%, a major event 35%, divorce or separation more than twofold, and death of a close relative about 36%. So these adverse events can have an effect on the body as well as the mind. And so when you're suffering emotionally, you may also be suffering physically. Oksana Polish in our group did a study in a recent sample of ours in which we looked at the relationship between early life traumatic stress or stress and the rapidity with which these women went from an initial diagnosis of breast cancer to a recurrence, to metastatic disease. And we found that those who had a traumatic stress history, sexual or physical abuse, for example, had only half the time between the initial diagnosis and recurrence than did those who had no stress history. And those with milder stress were in the middle. So it suggests that traumatic stress does things to our stress response systems that endanger us when we have cancer. So what can we do to treat depression and stress? This sculpture, by the way, was done by a Dutch breast cancer patient. And one of the remarkable things is not only does it depict her despair, but it's the only work of art she did in her life. And I think it's just a remarkable sculpture. So there are, of course, pharmacologic treatments that I mentioned for depression. They're very helpful, although we're now learning that certain antidepressants interfere with some of the hormonal treatments. So the antidepressant paroxetine and sertraline compete for metabolism with tamoxifen, which is an estrogen receptor blocker. Tamoxifen is what's called a prodrug. It's not the drug itself, but it's metabolized to the active drug. And the antidepressant competes with it at this cytochrome 450 system, such that you have less active tamoxifen, and it actually can shorten survival. So we're having to get more careful about what kinds of depression treatment we use. And there are many psychotherapies. Here's one example of psychotherapy for Californians here. The therapeutic highway here. I'm going to focus on some psychotherapy to give you a feeling for how we try to help cancer patients cope with the disease-related stress that they suffer. There are many individual as well as group forms of psychotherapy. For those who are psychoanalytically oriented, he's saying, I'm beginning to have second thoughts about group therapy. So there are 7 themes that we discuss in these groups. Making new social connections, learning to express rather than suppress emotion, detoxify fears of dying and death, reorder life priorities, strengthen families, clarify communications with physicians, and we teach them self-hypnosis for pain and anxiety control. We've written a number of articles and also a book on group therapy for cancer patients. Thomas Jefferson said, when angry, count 10 before you speak. If very angry, count 100. Mark Twain said, when angry, count 4. When very angry, swear. I'm on the Mark Twain side of this one, because many cancer patients feel that if they're controlling how bad they feel about the disease, they're actually controlling the disease. And one of the real burdens of the Simonton wish away your cancer approach is that they feel that they're letting their bodies down, they're letting their families down if they feel sad or scared about the cancer. And if I've learned one thing in 30 years of doing this research, it's that dealing with the real emotions that come with it doesn't hurt your body, it doesn't hurt you, it helps you. And so pretending that you're not afraid or sad is a way of alienating yourself from your loved ones and adding more stress to your body, not less. So, in one of the studies we did in our lab, we found that cancer patients who were high in emotional control were actually more anxious and depressed than those who were low in emotional control. So it doesn't work. But one of my breast cancer patients said, I was crying, and my husband walked in and said, stop crying, you'll make the cancer spread. And we called that the prison of positive thinking. You know, If you're not scared and sad and angry sometimes when you have cancer, you really do need a psychiatrist. You know, it's a kind of situation that triggers those natural emotional responses, and the thing is to use them and work with them. So what we taught women in this group is actually how to reduce their control of emotion. And this was a randomized psychotherapy trial, and we were able to show that we significantly reduced their tendency to suppress their emotion. That's the yellow line here, compared to the controls who didn't get the psychotherapy. So they learned to be less suppressive of their own emotions. And at the same time, Al Bandura here at Stanford developed self-efficacy theory. It's our ability to think we're managing things well. And we developed a scale along those lines. And the cancer patients who learned this felt that they were managing their emotions better, even though they were far less controlling of their emotions. So it worked. We also teach patients to deal with their fears of dying and death. Now, it may seem strange. There's nothing we can do about the fact that we die. But there's a lot we can do about the way we die. And in general, because we isolate people who are dying, we don't talk with them, we make them feel as if they're already dead. You know, how do we conceptualize death? It's you know, being removed from loved ones. There's an old African-American spiritual, you got to walk that lonesome valley by yourself. If we isolate people socially when they're sick, we make them feel as if they're already dead, and we worsen their death anxiety. So paradoxically, talking about death, grieving death in these groups. When we started these groups, Irv Yalom, my mentor who recruited me to Stanford many years ago, started one of these groups with breast cancer, and we were warned by oncologists that we'd make patients worse because they would see one another die and get demoralized. Well, we followed that very carefully. We studied them very closely to make sure we weren't making them worse. In fact, we were making them better, and I'll show you evidence for that. And if you think about it, death is not a novel concept to a cancer patient. You know, it has occurred to them that the illness could kill them. So watching people die in close company actually helps them learn to deal with dying and death. One of our patients, when another one died, made these little cards. Dear Eva, whenever the wind is from the sea, salty and strong, you are here. Remembering your zest for hilltops and the sturdy surf of your laughter, gentles my grief at your going and tempers the thought of my own. So these patients gain from it. And what I'd like to do, another example is a woman, Emily, who said, being in the group is like standing at the top of a tall building or the edge of the Grand Canyon. I don't like heights. But gradually you learn to look and you feel better about yourself because you're able to look. That's how I feel about death in the group. I'm able to look at it now. I can't say I feel serene, but I can look at it. So they gained a sense of strength by being able to face one another's death. They also saw that they shouldn't be marginalized. Somebody mentioned that earlier. That just because you're dying doesn't mean you're failing, doesn't mean you're letting people down. And if you can't see your own self-worth, you can see it in the 8 other women who are sitting around the room. We had one woman who came in, she was an elegantly dressed woman, matched accessories, everything, even when she was very sick, losing weight. And she came in one day and she said, my husband is a banker, but he's not a teller. He doesn't like to talk. And I think he's kind of, I think he's had it, and I should just find a way to shorten my life. And we could have speculated about the husband, but he wasn't in the room. I said, I think you're asking us a question. Have we had it with you? Would we be better off without you? And she got very powerful feedback about how much she meant, what a role model she was to the other women in the group. And in her will, when she died, they sent a limousine to the building where the group meets over at 401 Quarry and took us all to her memorial service where we spoke about her. So that kind of being together in the face of death is a powerful thing. So I want to show you an example of how the group faced one of its deaths to give you a feeling for what we do.
If we could each take a minute to think about what would I want to get from the group before it's over today? Test the waters a little more. What do I want? Because if it's hard in here, I can imagine it's really hard outside.
My main objective was to come in and help someone else regain hope, because you can get through it.
I'd like to make sure that what I do, what I decide to do with treatment and things for cancer is the best thing to do.
Gerald called me after I didn't show up last week. I thought, somebody cares that I wasn't feeling well.
When she called, you thought too.
Yeah. And I think that that's what I want from this group, is to find people who are supportive and caring about me.
And what do you want? What do you want?
I didn't really come wanting anything. I just volunteered for the study and Here I am.
Our October 2nd meeting was sweet and sad. The members were dealing in a more palpable way than they had previously with fears of dying. Debbie talked about planning her trip to Hawaii and how much she was looking forward to it, and at the same time, she knew that this would likely be her very last trip. This is October 30th, 1991. It was a pivotal meeting for the group because it was the first meeting after Debbie had died. Clearly, the group was challenged to face what they most feared and emerge either feeling closer and more supported or demoralized.
I mean, do we know anything?
That's what I was going to say. What happened to
What
Debbie?
happened?
I'd like to know what happened.
What do we know?
My understanding is that she got some fluid in her lungs and that a decision was made not to be extremely aggressive in trying to treat that they felt that the prognosis was good.
I'm angry that I don't have a chance to say goodbye. I mean, it just feels so abrupt.
Yeah.
And we weren't able to do anything, not knowing.
Yes. How does that, you would have wanted to be able to?
Yeah. Well, at least.
I would have, yeah.
Send a message with flowers.
Something.
Yeah. The issue that I hear everyone talking about is the lack of predictability. In the sense that here was Debbie talking about her trip to Hawaii, and now she's not with us.
There was a big bubble there of euphoria for her, and it was gone, and it wasn't a bubble, it was a big deep hole.
Better. Wish I had known her before cancer. I keep thinking, what was she like before? You know, because we never really knew the real Debbie, because she said that that wasn't the real Debbie.
I invested in her. I had feelings for her.
Can you tell us about the show?
Wish I could.
I would like to think about something.
Well, what would you say to her?
Not to worry and not to fear. And to have somebody there to tell you that. And just share it with her. And it's okay. And it's a that her family will be okay, they will be all right. And not for her to feel that guilty for being sick and guilty for dying on them, and they will continue.
What you're doing in that group is marching death right there in the center of that circle and forcing those women to look at it. They can't turn their eyes away from it. You're rubbing their nose in it.
Well, that was Bill Moyers. He has such a gentle way of asking questions. He told me that journalists are people who explain things they don't understand, which I sort of like. But he was right. We were rubbing their nose in it. And that is the essence of what's different about what we do with cancer patients and the pop psychology idea that you just wish it away. You know, one of my patients got a call from her oncologist that she'd had a recurrence of her disease. And she was at one of these new agey retreats somewhere in Marin County. They have them all the time. And he leans in the window of her car and says, "You caused your cancer, you can cure it." And she tried to roll the window up on his head, which I thought was a pretty good idea. But there is this sort of, you know, this sort of fantasy idea that you control everything. So, and the problem is that the opposite mistake is to say the mind has nothing to do with the illness at all. It isn't by wishing it away, but by handling stress better, we think you can make a difference. Now, what aspect of Debbie's death was the group focused on? What part of it? Suddenness of it, okay. And how was that, why were they focused on that? What did that mean to them? It could happen to any of them. So there was a certain amount of anxiety, that's right. But then what did they go on to discuss? They didn't get to say goodbye. So what are they starting to do now? This was the first death in this group. They're certainly starting to bond. They've been through a common terrible experience. And what else are they doing?
They're projecting Debbie's experience on what they might feel later.
Right, on what they might feel, but something else. And that is? Right, what they might do. That is, they're defining terms for a better death. And not that they're blaming Debbie, it was very sudden, but they're saying, well, when I go or when you go, we want to prepare for it. We want to be able to say goodbye. So they can't control the fact of death, but they can do a lot about the way they die. There's actually a wonderful new book out by Irv Yalom, who helped me start all this, called Staring at the Sun, about helping people to deal with and face their own dying. And it's very clear to me, if I haven't learned anything else, it's that helping people face this death together, face their own mortality together, helps them. It certainly doesn't hurt them. And let me show you some of the evidence. So we also encourage people, if they have limited time, to face those limitations and make decisions about how they want to live the rest of their lives, although not everybody gets it. I'm sorry, Mr. Rainey, our tests show you have 2 weeks to live, and he says, can I take them in August? You know? He's not clear on the concept. So what we try to do is convert anxiety into fear and depression into sadness. To convert a kind of general cloud of misery into something you can face and do something about. And we think that helps people manage the stress of this illness much better. So what are the results? He's saying, do you remember what you were feeling before you ate the other members of the group? It's a rare side effect that... So we looked at standard scales of mood disturbance in the women who were randomized to the support groups, that's the yellow line, and the ones in the control condition. And you see that there was a significantly greater reduction in distress in the treatment group, despite the fact that they were facing these kinds of deaths. They were watching one another die of the same illness. They wound up less anxious and depressed. And that replicates a finding we had 20 years earlier in another randomized trial of psychotherapy for breast cancer patients. The control group got worse, the treatment group got better. So we have solid data that shows that helping them confront these illnesses together, deal with their fears of dying and death, expressing emotion, reduces distress, it doesn't increase it. And this is from what's called a Cochrane database review. These are very tough-minded statistical reviews of outcomes of psychotherapy. And what it shows is there's significant evidence that even in cancer patients with very advanced disease, treatment, psychotherapy reduces depression and can help them live better. And I'm glad to say that our study was one of the studies that they cited in this review. Shakespeare, of course, knew that all long before. He said, give sorrow words, the grief that does not speak, whispers the oft-wrought heart and bids it break.
When you're, people are bonding to you, they're bonding to each other, they care about this group a lot. The group means something to them. One thing is being measured. Wouldn't their natural inclination be to say that thing gets better because they would feel disloyal, or saying anything else? So how accurate is measure in that situation?
Well, yes, I'll repeat the question. So she's saying that, well, these women are in the group, and isn't there some sort of social pressure for them to report that they're doing better? And of course, we don't just ask them, did the groups help you? We give them standard scales that ask them to rate on 80 items from a 0 to 5 scale, how anxious or frightened or depressed or sad are you? They do know why they're doing it. And it's a reasonable question, but on the other hand, I'd have to say that when you're dealing with breast cancer that's shortening your life, you probably care more about that than whether I'm happy and get to publish a paper. And so my general sense is that they told us the truth, and you know, things could have turned out better than they did too. So I think they were appreciative, thank you, of having the opportunity, but I don't think they were so appreciative that they would markedly alter their responses. It's a reasonable question, but I think the answer is probably no. Yes?
It seems like they don't have much reason to lie at that point.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I think, who was it? Boswell said the gallows concentrates a man's mind wonderfully. You know, you just, there are other things you focus on. Yes, in the back.
Isn't it a natural response to death to be depressed?
Well, the interesting thing is, while it isn't a natural response to death to be depressed, oddly enough, no. It's certainly natural to be sad or frightened or angry. But depression is this kind of reverberating cycle where you feel hopeless, helpless, and worthless. And I have to tell you, I went to the Mayo Clinic once to give grand rounds, and they had me go on work rounds with some patients. And I saw a woman who was dying that day. And she had scheduled a series of interviews with all of her family, half an hour each, to tell them what she thought of them and what she thought they better do with their lives. And, you know, she was the most hopeful woman I think I've ever met. So not sadness, yes, depression, no. And not, you know, it's a minority of people who are dying who are depressed. And there are good treatments for that depression right until the last hours of life. So it's very important that if they are depressed, we deal with it and not dismiss it as a natural consequence of dying. Yes, one more. Yes?
Have you had any experience with acupuncture helping alleviating depression? And have you used that?
The question is, does acupuncture alleviate depression? I've not seen so much data on that. It's certainly very good for pain, and pain exacerbates depression. So if you have a patient who has both depression and pain, and you treat the pain with acupuncture, you probably would have a positive effect on depression as well. In fact, one of the other effects of this group was to reduce pain. So we had a significant reduction in pain among the women randomized to the group compared to controls on the same and very low amounts of medication. And this replicated a finding we had 20 years ago in another randomized trial. So we can significantly reduce pain, and that in turn should have an effect on depression as well. So the idea is to help these women convert themselves from feeling damaged and stressed to transcending, to facing and dealing with what they're dealing with. This is the winged victory of Samothrace in the Louvre. You don't look at that and say, my God, there's a woman missing her arms and her head. You see it as an image of female power, of transcendence, and that's what we try to help these women do. He's got 3 types of cards. One says congratulations, one says get well, and one says good luck with the American healthcare system. Yeah. By the way, you know the definition of a Canadian? A Canadian is an American without a gun and with health insurance. So in the last few minutes, we've lost a little time, but I'll try and present some of the data we're gathering on what we think is going on in the body when these women manage their stress better. This was a paper we published in The Lancet in 1989. We were shocked to discover, because I mentioned Simonton and this wish away your cancer thing, we had this randomized psychotherapy trial. We knew we'd help the women emotionally. And it suddenly occurred to me, I ought to find out what happened to them. So we went to state death records, and we got the survival time for all of the women in the study. 83 of the 86 had died. And it turned out that there was a significant difference in survival time. The women randomized to group therapy lived an average of 18 months longer than the control patients. By 48 months, all the controls had died, and a third of the that's down here, and a third of the treatment group were still alive. So much to our surprise, helping them face death and dying, live better, seemed to help them live longer. Now this aroused a fair amount of attention. There was an article in the New England Journal by a group in Canada showing that there was a significant reduction in depression using a similar kind of psychotherapy, but no difference in survival time. So we attempted to replicate the study. We recruited a new sample of 125 women with metastatic breast cancer, randomized them to group therapy or a control condition. We found no overall survival difference, but an interaction with the type of cancer they had. So the ones who had a more serious kind, what's called estrogen receptor negative cancer, which is a more aggressive kind of breast cancer that does not respond to hormonal treatments, lived longer if they were randomized to the treatment group than the controls. And we think the difference may be because the hormonal treatments have gotten so much better with breast cancer that breast cancer mortality is going down. And we think that may have influenced the ER positive women, but not affected the ER negative women who still showed the treatment effect. And this is data from an epidemiologist named Pito showing this improvement in survival now that they've started to use more effective hormonal as well as chemotherapeutic agents as well. The other problem was we were haunted by our prior study. Most of our control patients were in support groups. In fact, I had a control patient in my office saying to me, I want the name of all the other controls in the study so I can start a support group with them. You know? I said, I don't think so. You know. This is a recently published study by Barbara Anderson at Ohio State University, randomized trial with women who had primary breast cancer. They got group therapy or standard care, and she also found a significant improvement in survival in the women who got the group therapy. So there are several studies now, independent studies, showing such an effect. And this was Thomas Kukler in Germany, published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, showing that GI cancer patients who got immediate intensive psychotherapy right after their surgical treatment lived longer over a 10-year follow-up than those who didn't. So there are studies that show it. All in all, 6 studies, randomized trials, show an effect of psychotherapy on cancer survival. 6 others show no difference. I'm glad to say there are no studies showing that psychotherapy kills patients. We don't shorten life. So it's still, I think, an important and an open question, but there is at least some evidence suggesting that living better with cancer may help you live longer. And there is plenty of evidence that social isolation is bad for your health. This is from a review by James House in Science, showing that people who were low in social isolation had about a 2-fold increase in their all-cause mortality rate, and this is true for cancer as well, than people who are well integrated socially. It might interest you to know that the kind of social integration that's good for your health if you're a man is being married. If you're a woman, it's not being married. It's relationships with other women. Which leads me to the unhappy conclusion that having a relationship with a man does your health no good at all, regardless of your own gender. And having a relationship with a woman does your health a great deal of good, regardless of your own gender. But social isolation is as bad a risk factor for mortality as smoking or high serum cholesterol levels. But we pay no attention to that, and we focus all our efforts on statins. That's very good, it's very important, but it's not the only way to improve health. So we're looking at dysregulation in various physiological systems that we think may have an effect on cancer progression. And because time is running short, I'll go through this fairly quickly. But we think that the way people respond to stress affects their endocrine and immune systems in ways that can affect the progression of cancer. And so we've been studying this with National Cancer Institute and National Institute of Aging Support. The stress response system that's primary is what's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and it helps us secrete cortisol, which is a stress hormone from the adrenal cortex that elevates glucose in the blood. So it prepares you to fight or flee. But in the interest of maintaining overall metabolism, when cortisol levels go up, the system starts to shut itself off so that you don't waste energy once the threat is over. But there's a concept called allostatic load, that repeated stressors, repeated hits on the system will tend to dysregulate it. So it isn't the big stress, it's the series of little stressors that we've talked about that can dysregulate this stress response system. So normally it should turn itself on and then turn itself off. But it's sort of like breaking a light switch. If you keep flicking it enough, it'll either get stuck in the on position or stuck in the off position. And we examined the pattern of cortisol throughout the day and night of women with metastatic breast cancer. Your cortisol levels, we're now in the nighttime, should be down about here. They should be a quarter as high as they were when you woke up in the morning. Waking up is a daily stress task, so your cortisol levels should be high. But people who are depressed tend to have high and relatively flat cortisol levels throughout the day. And we looked at this stress hormone in women with metastatic breast cancer and found that only about a quarter of them had nice normal patterns like this, and that those who had the abnormal patterns, where this stress hormone went up later in the day, wound up dying significantly sooner. So we could predict years ahead who was going to die sooner based just on their diurnal pattern of cortisol. We published this in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute, and it's independent of all the other risk factors for breast cancer progression. So disrupted stress hormones are a factor in predicting early mortality. And somebody asked a question about sleep. You had a question?
Yeah, I have a question about
Yeah.
sleep. But, so all these studies obviously are on women who have
Right,
metastatic breast
right.
cancer, and it seems like most of the studies in general have been done with women.
Right.
Are there reasons why the same studies haven't been done with prostate cancer, lymphoma, male populations, and would you predict that the results would be the same?
There are studies that have been done with male populations. Some of those studies that looked at psychotherapy and survival were, for example, in people with melanoma, both men and women. There are a lot of women with breast cancer, sadly. It's the most prevalent cancer among women and the second leading killer, second to lung cancer. So it is more common to do it. We think that the story is pretty much the same with men as well, but it just happens that it's a common cancer that has been heavily studied. It turns out that sleep disruption is associated with these abnormal cortisol patterns. And so we've been studying now sleep patterns and disruption in sleep. And one of the things that Oksana Polish from our group has found is that people who sleep better at night are better able to self-soothe during the day. We call it vagal tone. It's the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. When you really calm yourself down, you have better vagal tone. And it's associated with better sleep at night. Now, we all feel that. You know, if you had a bad night's sleep, you just feel crummy the next day, and you can't calm yourself as well. And it turns out that there is parasympathetic nervous system activity that's different when people sleep well. And the parasympathetic system is in control of your body at night too. So it's a way of turning down the sympathetic system, turning up the parasympathetic system, and that can affect the stress response as well. In fact, our breast cancer patients whose sleep got worse in the initial year died significantly sooner. And again, it wasn't just 2 months before they died, losing sleep about the proximity of death. This was months or years before. So sleep disruption is another independent risk factor for cancer, and we've been, I think, asleep at the switch and not recognizing that circadian rhythms are a very important part of stress and health, helping people live better and potentially live longer. We're now doing a study sponsored by the National Cancer Institute measuring sleep of metastatic breast cancer patients, and if you know of anyone with that disease, we can pay them to come into the hospital and have their sleep monitored for 36 hours, measure their hormones, and we're trying to learn more about these hormonal systems. So please give Beta or myself a call, and we'd welcome them. Yes?
What about certain countries where people take naps midday?
Oh, you mean Italy? We haven't studied that, Italy and Spain. They have very different circadian patterns, but we think probably their stress hormones are normalized by it. And actually, the afternoon nap, we all have a nadir about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And that's a time when your cortisol should be declining more. And we think the sleep may actually help it to decline more. It probably doesn't trigger another increase in cortisol. But it's an interesting question. We haven't studied that. Yes?
If sleep is a problem for cancer patients or for anyone, why not let them use sleep aids? Does that have the same effect as...
Well, if sleep is a problem, why not let them use sleep aids? They can help. The problem is most of the pharmacologic sleep aids work for a short time, but you tend to get habituated. You need more to get the same effect, or they just stop working. There are some, there's an old antidepressant called Deserel, which is sedating and is used, and people don't habituate to, that we use sometimes. Sleep hygiene is important too. You know, one trick is don't have your clock facing your bed, because if you wake up and you see, oh my God, it's 4 in the morning, that's an arousal cue. You know, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, you're waking yourself up. So there are things you can learn to do. We think normalizing sleep, and people just don't get enough sleep. They don't go to bed early enough. You know, so it's an important thing, but the medication is not the whole story, unfortunately. So I see we're at 8:20. We lost it. Can we go a little bit longer? What do you think? I've got a few more minutes. Okay. Thank you. So we've been looking at other measures, particularly the other aspects of the endocrine and the immune system, to try to understand how stress and sleep disruption may influence cancer progression. And there are a couple of really interesting findings. You may have heard of the gene BRCA1. It's an oncogene that if you have an abnormal form of it, your risk of lifetime breast cancer goes from 7 or 8% to 85%. So it's a gene. It's a gene that is designed to destroy transformed cells, to help them end their own lives when they change too much. And if that gene is damaged, you're at much greater risk for getting breast cancer. Well, it turns out if you put cortisol on mammary cells, you can inhibit the expression of this gene. So it may be that abnormal levels of this stress hormone, which we see in these women with the disrupted circadian patterns, are actually inhibiting expression of genes that tend to regulate tumor cells and downregulate their growth. We found also that patients with the abnormal cortisol patterns had lower numbers of natural killer cells. These are lymphocytes that don't look for antigens like a bacterial antigen. They look for transformed and dying cells, and they kill them. So they're part of the body's natural tumor surveillance network, and fewer numbers of those cells are associated with more rapid cancer progression, and were also associated with the sleep disruption. So we've recruited, with Dean Pizzo's help, Firdos Dabar, who is a national authority on psychoneuroimmunology, and he and I are working together to understand the relationship between endocrine and immune dysfunction that can affect cancer progression. Yes, you had a...
Are there medications that effectively mediate cortisol levels?
The problem, are there drugs, is the question that could change cortisol levels. The problem is that most of the ones that do are themselves cortisol-like. So you could lower the endogenous cortisol, but you would be exposing the body with drugs like dexamethasone to similar cortisol effects. We were looking, there was a drug that's called a CRH antagonist that would tell the body to stop producing or releasing cortisol, but it turned out to be toxic to the liver and it was taken off the market. So we're looking for drugs that will do that, but we haven't found the right one yet. This is a study that Dr. DeBar and I did in which we found that depression actually inhibits our measures of cell-mediated immunity. And so we think there's a direct connection between depression, higher cortisol levels, and lower aspects of immune function that we just published. So that's the trail that we're on now, looking at these hormonal endocrine links. And this is a study by another group that shows that stress hormones like norepinephrine can trigger the growth of blood vessels that support tumors. So there are a number of pathways by which stress can directly facilitate tumor growth or inhibit the body's immune and other mechanisms for surveillance against cancer. So that's how we think stress affects psychological response, hormonal and circadian responses that can have an effect on tumor growth. In summary, stressors are best handled with the acronym FACES. Face rather than flee from stressors, alter your perception of your situation, learn to cope actively, find some aspect of the stress you can do something about, express rather than suppress emotion, and enhance social support. In that way, feeling may lead to healing. This is our Center on Stress and Health. They're a wonderful group of people. This is Oksana Palesh, who is in our group, Heather Abercrombie, Janine D.C. Davis. They're wonderful people who have been working for decades to help us understand what we've learned, and I want to thank our patients as well, who have given very generously of their time and sometimes answered our questionnaires honestly, I hope. I want to acknowledge our funding from the National Institute on Aging, the National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Mental Health, the California Breast Cancer Research Program, your tobacco tax dollars at work, the Charles A. Dana Foundation, and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. I want to briefly mention our Center for Integrative Medicine here at Stanford. She's saying chicken soup aisle 4 alternative medicines. The center was started in 1998. We have physicians, psychologists, acupuncturists, massage therapists, and instructors. We do hypnosis, biofeedback, supportive care program now at the Cancer Center, a variety of treatments to help people cope with serious illness. We have classes on forgiveness, journaling, love yourself for everyone else's sake, and a very popular class on mindfulness-based stress reduction taught by Mark Abramson. We're available on the web, and this is the contact information. Here's one of our successful patients. Shakespeare said, when we our betters see bearing our woes, we scarcely think our miseries our foes. The mind much sufferance doth o'erskip when grief hath mates and bearing fellowship. But I want to remind you finally that dealing with the mind-body situation is a tricky business. He's saying, what happened here, Sergeant? He says it's a placebo overdose. We're pretty sure he only thinks he's dead. Thank you for your attention.
Well, we've gone over the time, but it's just in your mind. And I want to thank Dr. Spiegel for a wonderful presentation. I know you enjoyed it. And of course, as we complete this quarter, we'll be putting up all of the quarter's lectures up on Stanford YouTube and iTunes, so you'll be able to see this all again and think about it one more time. So this ends our time together. For those who are leaving this quarter and not returning, re-examine your reasons for doing that. Still time to come in. We have a few more places left. Tell your friends in the next quarter, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody back who's coming. And I want to thank all of you who did come to this last quarter for doing so. It's been a joyous activity for all of us, and I think if you have lingering questions about your mind and your body and whether they're connected or not, Dr. Spiegel will be here for a few moments. Thanks again and good night.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.